Hey everybody, welcome to another fun and exciting episode of The Quick Draw with me as your host, Mike. With me is my more delightful and somewhat darker alter ego, John.
A little bit. Just a little bit.
I feel like I kind of offset that in some ways. So
yeah, you're the one. Well, you listen to enough hip hop to make up for it.
And we're gonna have a fun conversation. I actually debated. I was gonna bring this up with you, John, earlier this week, but I kind of slipped my mind. And plus, I decided it was a bad idea anyway. Given the topic, we could do this au natural. It just in the buff. Hey, ladies.
Wait, what?
We already debated if we're gonna do that with Will. Oil Guns America, if he ever comes on, because that will be the most watched show we do.
I'm not doing
So we are going to talk about natural law, natural rights tonight. It's a fascinating topic. I think it's one that is something we should talk about more in society. It's kind of funny. I've noticed a trend where if you bring it up, leftists don't seem to be really well versed in it, or if they do, they know it's something that conservatives believe in, and they dismiss it out of hand without really understanding it. So here on the show to join us, back by popular demand, is Eric Shaffer. Welcome back to the program, Eric.
It's Shaffer, you uncultured swine.
It's spelled Shaffer. I'm sorry. If I had a C, I would have said Shaffer. But it's chaff. It's spelled exactly like chaff with an S.
All right.
It's because of the two F's. I think that's what makes it hard, because I was gonna say with one F, you'd probably say Schaefer naturally, but
if it was SCH. And the funny thing is that every time I type his name, I'm like SC. No, I forgot. I got to get rid of the C because then I can't find him on Twitter, because Twitter will figure it out. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Chris in the chat brings up a good point that it's really funny people don't know much about American rights because it's our entire American political theory is based on it. But here we are. So
hey, look, the public school system is failing us in another way.
I want to touch on that because liberals like to point out how stupid people are, especially for voting for Trump. And I'm like, guys, you control the education system.
Right. You're the ones against school choice. I wonder why everyone is so dumb, because they keep going to the schools you make them go to.
It's like if we're going to assume that people voted for Trump purely out of stupidity, which I don't think that's fair, but let's assume for the sake of argument it's true. Guess what, guys? You're the ones who taught them to be idiots. So that's on you again.
Well, to speak to kind of how little they're versed in, and I remember when I was having my Second Amendment debate with the college Democrats, me and Elise Yost, who was the president of the UNCW College Republicans at the time, I brought up natural rights. Like the founding fathers believed that we had a natural right to self-preservation and to defend ourselves from outside forces, particularly a tyrannical government. And the instant I bring up natural rights, the other side, and I respect the college Democrats. I like them a lot, but I could see them go like, they were confused.
Deer in the headlights look.
You don't get to defend yourself. The hell is this? It was like...
Well, I mean, this is really important though, because the left likes to use the language of rights. Right? They will talk about the right to an abortion. They'll talk about the right to feel safe. They'll use the language of rights when it suits them. But then when you try to dive into what that means, like I used to do this all the time back when gay marriage was like a big debate, and people say, "Well, people have a right to get married." I'm like, "Do they? Like, where does that right come from?" And then it's almost always the Supreme Court. I'm like, do you understand what dangerous precedent you are setting by saying that? Like, do you even think the government can give you rights? That means the government can take them away.
Yeah, that's what they believe in the UK. That's why they've murdered 2 children. But anyway, just saying. Your rights.
But
this
is conservatives kind of get it wrong too, I think, because I have noticed, it's not common, but I have noticed that sometimes we tend to conflate natural rights and natural law. We talk about them as if they're synonymous, and that's not technically true. That's actually not true at all. But I wanted to get your take on this, Eric. Like, what? Look, well, let's talk about natural rights. So, like, when we want to explain this to liberals, to the left, like, how do you explain it? How do you get them to understand where it just like it clicks? And they're like, oh, that's what you mean by natural rights.
And in what color crayon do you write that?
All right. Well, first off, and we're kind of talking about this a bit before the podcast. I do want to say that in conservative circles, and I've debated a lot of people on this, like who aren't conservative, like on natural rights, particularly Mark Pellegrino. We debated about it, like natural rights versus secularism, on my podcast. I think the problem in conservative circles, before like I go in how I explain it, is that there's no room for any other morality. We were kind of talking about this before. For example, if natural rights are the only way, you cannot derive morality from any other source, which kind of is a kick to the balls for atheists, considering that they don't believe in God. Natural rights are fundamentally, they rely on, and whether you believe in a Christian God or not, on an omniscient creator. I believe that in society, I think our society should be based on natural rights, but at the end of the day, we should be open to Kantian logic. As long as people are living within the moral fabric that is set by our society, I think we should be open to explaining different philosophies to them. But when I describe natural rights, before getting all religious, because natural rights are inexplicably tied to, maybe not one religion in particular, but they're tied to a God. They're tied to a deity. So when I explain natural rights, I essentially just say, to start it off, natural rights are essentially rights that you have in a state of nature that can be violated, but cannot be just stripped away from you.
But my separation of church and state, Eric.
Well, that's the thing, is when people talk about a separation of church and state, you can bring the morality that you learned at church into, governance. You just can't use church as the only, as the value is, you can't use church as the primary example or as the primary logic, or I guess not church, but religion, as the primary logic behind the logic and the policy that you're proposing. So I would
actually wait, because I want to stop you there, because I think that's a really interesting point you bring up, because I would actually argue that you can. Absolutely, under our Constitution, under the Declaration, for the majority of our court jurisprudence, or our history of jurisprudence, you can.
Yeah,
it's not very persuasive. You're not going to convince the irreligious or the a-religious that you're right. But if you're an elected official and you absolutely want to make you want to ban, I don't know, shellfish, because the Old Testament says you can't eat shellfish. You can. There is nothing in the First Amendment. There is nothing in non-progressive court law, and there's nothing in the Declaration of Independence and what our founders understood to say you can't do that. It's just when you start trying to enforce it, when you start trying to convince people why it's right, you're going to run into some speed bumps. And if you can't get the people on board, then you're kind of shooting. It's a Sisyphean.
Well, I'm not saying that it would be unconstitutional to do it. I'm just saying it's not proper or effective. I wouldn't want you bringing a policy into government. I think the founding fathers had this belief overall, and I personally have this belief, that I believe in a more secular government. Again, you can bring your morality into it. You can bring whatever morality you have from a religion into it. But I don't want your religion to be the sole basis for your policy. But a more secular government with a religious society. I think that's the philosophical basis for the nation's inception. Now, I'm not saying that it would be unconstitutional for, let's say a senator comes in and wants to ban shellfish and says they totally just use their religion as justification. I'm not saying that's unconstitutional. I'm not saying by law you can't do that. I'm just saying that A, isn't very effective, and B, is rather it's not helpful.
Okay, so no, we agree on that point.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the idea of separation of church and state, again, not a constitutional idea, but that I think is what was meant by it. The only purpose of separation of church and state was not because the left has twisted that into this idea that means that nothing you say, do, think, anything can be influenced even slightly by your religious faith. But what they meant was simply, okay, you can't have like, okay, the official church of the United States is this. That's all that really meant, I think.
And to your point too, John, like, especially with social issues, divisive social issues, whether it's gay marriage, abortion, birth control, whatever, right? There is a religious component often in those laws. And what the left will argue is that religion is the only component. You'd only support a ban on abortion, even though there are plenty of pro-life atheists, right? You'd only support abortion if you're a religious individual, and thus it is a religious law, and therefore is unconstitutional. That's their reasoning, right? That's why I say, and I think Eric, I think we agree on this. It's okay. There's nothing wrong. We want to refute the notion that just because something is religious or only inspired by religion, we want to eliminate that idea that it doesn't belong in the public sphere. It absolutely does. One of my favorite quotes is by John Richard Niehaus. He's a Catholic thinker. And I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have the quote in front of me, but he basically says, like, an idea or a moral opinion does not become disqualified for being religious any more than it does for being secular, psychoanalytic, Marxist, or just plain dumb. Everyone's entitled to bring their morality to the public sphere. It's just, how persuasive can you be? If I'm going to argue, morality from the Book of Mormon, I'm not going to convince very many non-Mormons. Like, that's just not how it's going to work.
Right.
Yeah.
Even if what I say agrees with, like, the Bible, the fact that I'm using the Book of Mormon will actually tell, people will turn away from it and say, oh, that's that weird Mormon book. I don't want to touch that. Play was funny though.
I mean, listen, there is one part of the Constitution that kind of is kind of a concrete separation of church and state, and that's the Establishment Clause. As long as you don't violate that, I mean, you can't just say to someone, because they bring their religious morality into something, oh, you're not allowed to bring that into code, you're not allowed to bring that into law, it's a violation of church and separation of church and state. I mean, listen, again, that would be a violation. That
would itself would be a violation of the Free Exercise Clause.
Yeah, exactly.
Two horns of one amendment.
Exactly, but I think it's not helpful when the only argument you can bring, and I think Shapiro says this all the time, not to quote Shapiro too much.
But you and me both.
You can never quote Shapiro too much.
Yes.
Now you say that.
I have heard so many. Okay, wait, I got a bone to pick real fast. Not with you guys. I've heard so many college kids, not at my school, luckily, but so many college kids, and I've been guilty of it once, and I caught myself, and I was like, no, I can't do this. Use Shapiro's arguments verbatim. I'm like, do not use the man's arguments verbatim. That makes you sound like just someone who listened to his podcast one day, didn't make up their minds for themselves, and decided to regurgitate that. And this is nothing against Shapiro. I hear people doing it all the time with a lot of people.
At least give the man credit. I mean, come on.
No, I mean, he's an extremely intelligent guy, and he makes extremely good arguments. But like, you shouldn't be like regurgitating his arguments verbatim. But
Catherine in the live chat wants to know what your cool mic is, Eric. I can see it, but
it's a Blue Yeti Pro.
Oh, that's why you. Hey, I might get one. I was going to say, because mine's a blue. Blue is the brand, right?
Dude, it's amazing. Yeah,
it's fine. So mine's a blue snowball. So like, but it's not wanting to.
Solid. Yeah, it's really good for podcasting. Like, it gives it that. Have you guys ever heard the Joe Rogan Experience?
Yeah.
Yeah, it gives it like the audio sound. It gives it that Joe Rogan vibe.
Mike says nothing. Like what?
Especially if you talk into it really quietly.
I don't think a microphone is what we're lacking for the Joe Rogan experience. That's just my take.
No, I mean like the audio feel, like the way the audio sounds, like how he's like all really super close to the mic. Like if you like, hey there guys, what's up? Joe Rogan experience. It just sounds.
Oh,
really
hey,
nice.
that was kind of sexy.
Cool.
I'm not gonna lie. I got a little
Totally
tingle right
was.
there.
No, totally was. I was gonna say.
You guys,
and with that, Eric is red.
But I think it's Ash Shapiro.
You are pretty red. I'm just saying. Anyway,
Shapiro says this all the time, where he tries to make an argument. I think almost everyone on the right, if they're respectable in terms of policy debate, that he tries to make his argument secular. He tries to make it appeal to everyone, but if you like questioned him over and over and over again to get the argument that he's making to its root, it would go back to religion. I think that's how religious people should be. You make secular arguments using evidence based on your religious morality. I think that's fine.
Absolutely. And that's a proper role for religion. I think religion is kind of a compass, right? If we're talking about morality, it's a moral compass. It kind of puts you in the right direction.
Yeah.
Right. But your job as someone who advocates a particular morality or belief or idea is to point out all the landmarks and specific directions as you go along the way, right? That's what articulating it and pointing to evidence and saying, okay, this is how I know I'm going in the right direction. See, look, the compass is pointing north, and as I'm walking, I see moss on the same side of the rocks as the direction I'm walking.
Yeah.
So therefore, I know the compass is good.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I think
that
again,
in Scouts. That was one of the few things I learned before I quit Scouts.
Well, even with natural law theory, and this is one of the things that sometimes annoys me with Kantian people, like not Kant himself, but Kantian theory, when they question natural law theory. Even natural law theory calls for a use of rationality to determine your surroundings and to judge what's the best action to take and how that deals with the natural goods that are set out. You need to use rationality in natural law and natural rights theory, and to say that rationality is totally void in religiously based philosophies, I think is kind of ignorant of the philosophies themselves. And I'm not saying Kant in his writings had these problems, but I'm just saying a lot of people who agree with Kant that I've run into have this problem. They think because it has a religious base, there's no room for human rationality in the equation.
Right, and that's actually something that I feel like we've got the dumbed down new atheists to in part to. Well, they're not the cause; they're kind of a symptom of that problem, because that's literally their entire shtick, is just to basically say. And I honestly think it's kind of a fig leaf to show that there's no proof for their own way of thinking. Is to just say, well, if you have any kind of religious bearing, you're irrational, and haha, look at you, you're an idiot. And then it's like, but what about what you believe? Shut up, we're talking about you. And it's like, and I think that's basically, I think, where that points. And I think, but they're a symptom of that idea, is that they basically don't try to explain their own position. They just say anybody who believes in religion has to be irrational, has to be, duped by the system, at the opiate of the masses and whatnot. Again, listen to who? Dawkins, to Hitchens when he was around. Who am I thinking of? Dawkins. Who's the other one? Dennett. Daniel Dennett. People like that. When you get the God delusion type stuff. And I think that's what's happening, is that the reason why this debate is so hard to hold is precisely because the idea of the day now is, if you're religious, you're irrational, and there's no room for it. The only way to be rational is to not be religious.
But couldn't you argue then that that's one of the reasons why the founders and kind of the philosophers that preceded them talked about natural law, right? They didn't talk about God's law, even though you could argue that's what they meant, right? They always talked about natural rights, natural law, as kind of a way to broaden the umbrella under which people can kind of fit under that ideology. And I like that, Eric, that you brought up Immanuel Kant, because I think his approach to morality is a really good way to understand natural law, because you're right, we're supposed to use reason, but how do you interpret what is natural law? Some of the great movements in America, from the Revolution to the Civil Rights Movement, appeal to natural law in terms of saying this law is justified because it aligns with natural law. This law is bad because it doesn't align with natural law. So how do you figure out what is natural law? And one of the things I like about Immanuel Kant is that his test for whether or not something was moral or not is like, well, apply it universally. If you take a moral principle and then apply it to everyone, what's the logical outcome? And if the logical outcome is it's bad for everyone, it would be bad. There would be very bad outcomes if you applied it universally. Then it's bad. Don't do it. Yeah. And if you apply it universally and it applies to everyone, yay, go with that. I mean, actually, it doesn't even. It's not even a positive test. Even if you apply it universally and nothing bad happens, well, then you actually have to try it out. And then if empirically you notice, okay, this thing that we didn't anticipate that was bad, that happened, a law of unintended consequences, if you do that, then you got to pull back and say, okay, whoops, experiment failed. Let's not do this. Bye. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, for natural law itself, and I'm not saying my whole theorem is that the best combination for a philosophy, the best combination is something of, Kant with, Aquinas or typical natural and Locke, like typical natural law, natural rights theory. But just like
some Catholic is cringing because you compared Aquinas to a lowly philosopher.
Heresy! No, this is also. I mean, by the way, I'm a Catholic.
I could just imagine.
I kind of figured that.
Steph McWilliams freaking out over that. I'm just kidding.
I gathered you were a Catholic because you have a.
I saw the statue too in the back.
Virgin Mary back there, and I was like,
I'm gonna figure it out.
I was like,
a Catholic, a Mormon, and a Unitarian will walk into a podcast.
No, not Unitarian, Unificationist. But anyway,
Unification. I'm sorry.
I don't know what Unitarian. What is Unitarian anyway? I don't know.
That's a Protestant. Jefferson was a Unitarian. Anyway.
Right.
One of the leading beliefs behind natural law theory, as stated by Aquinas, and I'm sorry if I misstate one of them or I forget one of them, but I think it was based on. It was based on the basic goods. It was based on the basic goods, and the basic good, that's how you interpreted natural law. And the basic goods were something like life, reproduction, educate one's offspring, seek God, form a society, avoid offense, and shun ignorance. I think I got all those. It was basically the 7 basic goods were what determined natural law.
What does he derive? I mean, how does he argue that then?
Basically, he believes that, and again, I don't want to make Aquinas' arguments for him here. If I got it wrong, someone correct me in the chat. But basically, from my understanding of Aquinas, what he argued was that how you derive the basic goods, where you could derive it essentially from God's word in the Bible, that these were the basic goods. And then stuff like live in a society and avoid offense and shun ignorance. It's hard to explain. Okay, so basically, Aquinas believed that God created all animals and humans alike, with with predetermined morality. Essentially, that you knew what's best for you immediately. And the way you know what's best for you immediately is because God puts it there. So, for example, but not just conscience. Like, for example, with one of the number one basic good, life. How he determined that life was there because of God was because we have a survival instinct. Most of us do. Like, I'm not going to, I'm not going to jump into a vat of sulfuric acid because I want to live. I value my own life. And then the theory was, okay, you see your life as valuable. Thus, you should take that to the next extreme. It's kind of like Kant's universality. You take that to the next level. Since your life is valuable, all other man's life should be valuable. So essentially, Aquinas believed that all people were instilled, all creatures were instilled with some sort of natural way to live. And people like who question, well, you know, why would you break the natural law then? Why would you go against what God pre-programmed you with? Aquinas usually said this was due to ignorance or emotion. Either emotion overrode your rational thinking, or you were ignorant of what was really best for you, and you did something else that you thought may be best for you. And I don't agree with Aquinas.
I would be interested then to see what if somebody starts using this, because this sounds like an argument you could use, for example, for gay marriage.
Yeah.
So, but this is Aquinas we're talking about. I seriously doubt he advocated that. So,
no, yeah.
How would you reconcile those two?
Well, here's the issue. I'm mainly going over this. I don't agree with Aquinas on everything. Like I said, I agree with kind of, I agree with more of a Kantian. I agree with more of a Kantian, Aquinas, Lockean mix of the philosophies. That's where I kind of stand.
It's a grab bag of philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. I don't because I think natural law on its own, how Aquinas poses it, it poses too many contradictions. It opens too many philosophical cans of worms. And
I like that you say that, because when I was doing research and kind of boning up on this for not only the show, but for that article that I wrote for Halsey News, that was my takeaway. I'm like, this is like nailing Jello to a wall. It's really hard to pin natural rights. I feel like if you ask me about natural rights, I can talk about natural rights all day. I feel like I'm an expert on it. Like I can explain to you what natural rights are, where they come from, how it works. Mm-hmm. Because and John Locke's treatises on government, I think, is the best example of natural rights. Right? You identify the state of nature. What is man in his most primeval state? Right, his state of nature, and then you say, okay, well, if a man is by himself, what can he do by himself? Okay, when a man is interacting with other men, what can they do without, impeding each other? Yeah. When you get to natural law, it's like, okay, because natural right is what can you do?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, natural right. Natural right is what can you do? What are you allowed to do?
Natural law is what should you do?
Yeah, natural law is what should you do? And so that's what gets sticky, because it's like, okay, like it's kind of like pornography, when you see it. Like I know what a good deed is when I see the good deed, but if you were to sit there and try to tell me to come up with a list of all the good deeds that need to be done for the for the good, for the ultimate good, I'd be like, have you got all day?
Yeah. That sounds also like the whole is ought problem, the idea that you can't derive what ought to be from what is, which is why they say you can't derive morals from science, which I actually think makes some sense, because I mean, in general, again, because science is just basically telling you what you can do, not necessarily what you should do. I mean, how many movies does it take to show us what science shows us? Hey, we can do this thing, but should you? Should you really?
Well, that's why I always find the debate more, science versus religion to be absolutely stupid. They're separate things. Like science tells you what the universe is. It describes how the universe works and why it works the way it does, and it's a description of what is. Religion doesn't talk about what is. It talks about what ought to be. It talks about morality and good and evil. And it may try to allegorically explain, the universe, where we come from, why we're here, where we're going. But those are very broad, very vague. Like, I'm a very religious person. I believe in a heaven and hell. I believe in a living God. I believe in the Bible. And
I thought you were Islamic.
What?
I thought you were Islamic.
Well, there is a prophet involved in my religion, but it's not that guy. But like, I believe in those things, but the more I learn, but I'm also a scientist. Like my degree's in mechanical engineering. I minored in mathematics. My emphasis was in biomechanics and biomedical engineering. I love the sciences. If I ever have the money and the time and the inclination to do it, I may go to med school because I love medicine. Yeah. So I'm very much a scientist, and yet there's no cognitive dissonance. There's no tension between those two roles. Actually, I'm religious where I should be, and I'm scientific where I should be, and those things jive harmoniously just fine. Yeah. Like I don't ever have an issue. And the more I learn about science, then it's not like the more I learn about science, the more I question my faith. No, the more I learn about science, the more my faith is reinforced.
Well, that actually, yeah. Sorry, John. Go ahead.
Oh, it's okay. I was just going to say that this actually reminds me of a fantastic book, because one thing that is mentioned, it's Darwin's House of Cards by Tom Bethel. And one of the things he points out is that actually there really never was an antipathy between science and religion. It's really, actually, Darwin was the one who basically brought it into play, that before Darwin, there really wasn't a conflict between science and religion. Almost all the classical scientists were Christian anyway. Look, every major university pretty much in Europe was founded by the church. So, it's not like the only reason they're at odds is because I think where science and religion kind of intersect when it comes to philosophy is when it comes to origins. Where do we come from and why are we here? Because those questions pretty much put all the rest of them into a particular perspective. If you argue from Darwin was the guy who tried to find a way to explain how we're here without appealing to any kind of teleology whatsoever, which I would argue he failed miserably in doing, but he tried. He tried very hard, and a lot of people who wanted to believe him and still want to believe him, even though his theory to explain origins was a massive failure. But
do we want to do the evolution debate here? I'll give you my take on that.
Honestly, I believe. Here's what you need to know about me. I believe in evolution. I don't believe that it disproves that there's a God out there, but I'm not. I'm fully willing to admit that I'm not ready to debate that on a very deep level.
Okay, well, I'll briefly give you my take, and you can tell me if you like it, and if you like it, you can use it. Okay. First of all, I don't believe in creatio ex nihilo. I never have. And my faith doesn't teach creatio ex nihilo. For you non-theologians, creation ex nihilo is creation out of nothing. I don't believe that God snapped his fingers and the earth was formed out of absolutely nothing. There were materials there that he used, and he created it out of pre-existing materials. And at which point the obstinate theologian comes in and says, but did he create the materials? I'm like, yeah, let's not get into that right now.
Well, that's a big bang.
That's right. So the argument I will use, and it depends on who my audience is. If I'm arguing with atheists about evolution, I will explain quite simply that, look, evolution exists. If what you mean by evolution is genetic change over time, right? Evolution, simply defined in any biology textbook, is genetic change over generations due to natural or sexual selection, genetic drift, or random mutation. That's how genes change, right? And all the science in the world demonstrates that that exists, and not a single religion or religious teaching refutes that. Where Darwinists and creationists combat each other is, okay, does the existence of evolution mean that we evolved from a lower life form or a common ancestor to other animals? You can't prove that. You cannot, there is no empirical evidence whatsoever to prove that man evolved from an ape-like ancestor, right? Because we can't find that missing link, right? We can point to evidence that makes us think, okay, there's something to that theory, but we cannot definitively prove that theory. Just like we can't prove definitively, empirically, that there is a God who blinked his eyes and said, let there be light, and there was light. Those are all theories of the origin of man, right? Now, if I'm arguing if I'm arguing with Christians who want to do a God of the gaps thing, I'll point out that, well, for evolution to exist, you have to have death. Death did not exist prior to Adam and Eve falling. Therefore, evolution was not the method that God used to create Adam and Eve. There are some Christians who try to do that. That's a God of the gaps theory.
So you're talking about the biologos type people.
Yeah.
And which is theistic evolution, which I don't think is accurate either. I tend to side with intelligent design. I think that all evidence shows us that it is abundantly obvious life cannot exist unless it is purposely engineered. It cannot.
Well, I'll be the first to tell you that because here's the thing. So, like I mentioned earlier, I'm an engineer. Right? What defines an engineer, be it mechanical, civil, chemical, or electrical, is that we learn not just physics and chemistry and biology and the sciences. There's an actual aspect of engineering that has to do with design. In other words, learning how to take these sciences and apply them in a design framework, right? So that you can build things and construct things that actually, one, work, and two, don't fall apart when somebody uses them.
Right.
So when you understand design theory, when you understand the principles of design, and then you look at, like I mentioned, my emphasis was in biomechanics and biomedical engineering. So I studied a lot of anatomy, a lot of physiology, but not through the lens of a doctor who's trying to fix things, but through the lens of an engineer who's trying to design things. And let me tell you, the more I learn about the human body, the more that I learn about physiology and anatomy from the perspective of an engineer, the more I'm convinced there's a design framework in play.
Oh, it goes deeper than that. I was going to say
let me put it this way. If I was going to design a robot, if I was going to design the perfect autonomous robot, I would use the human body as a template.
Yeah.
And the only thing it would lack is a spirit or a soul or something to make it an individual, because I can't create that.
Well, this is really interesting, but I remember it was a really long time ago. I can't remember what news site this was on, but I was reading an article one day that basically said this computer coder, he said that he used to be an atheist until one day he kind of looked at a model of the, DNA human genome, like how our DNA is built. And he said that how our DNA is built, like how precisely it's put together, and it reminded him of when he handcrafts code with a specific intention to create something. And he said, looking at how DNA is structured and how much care and thought kind of goes into it, he was like, that converted me. Like, there's no way that exists. And I would never use this in an argument against an atheist, but he's just going like, there's no way that exists without something else interfering directly. There's no way that naturally forms.
It's a good way to start, though. I could probably argue that a little deeper. I don't know how well I could argue it with. It depends on the atheist, but I know enough about like the theories of informatics and things like that. And the reason I brought it up also was just because of that supposed divergence between science and religion. Because of the origins question is important because it's the one place where they intersect, and you have to kind of decide one way or the other. And I believe that you have, on the one hand, you have materialism, and then on the other hand, you have, I guess, I don't know what you want to call it, but it's not even theism. It's just the idea that there's more to us than just the parts. That there's something immaterial there that makes us us. And
well, now did you bring up a good point, John? I want to tie this back to natural rights.
That's where I was going, but
yeah, okay, perfect. We're on the same wavelength as always. So that's where this kind of ties into natural rights, right? Because you have to have an understanding of where you come from, where we come from, in order to have an understanding of what is and isn't a natural right. Is that where you're going to go with that?
Well, I was going, basically, that if there's no teleology behind where we come from, then our lives really have no meaning, in which case there's no point in revering human life in a certain way. And I think this is what comes up in the abortion debate. This is what came up in the debates very clearly, because I had several debates with people about Alfie Evans and Charlie Gard. And if I didn't know any better, if I had to guess what the bearing of the people who I was talking to was, I'd wager every one of them was a materialist, Darwinistic thinker. The reason I think that is because you could only from a materialistic standpoint could you argue that the idea that, well, death with dignity is so important. That basically, because one of them even said outright, the only possible way you could think that it was wrong to do this is if you're religious. And the fact that anyone would even say that, to me, is indicative that what they're saying is, I'm not religious, and that's why I don't see this as a problem. And if you adopt materialistic thinking, this is why natural rights are important, because depending on where those rights come from and how much value we have, that the application of that becomes a bit of an issue. Because if our rights are just an arbitrary thing that government gives and takes away, then we have no rights, naturally or otherwise. If we have a creator, and this is why it's so hard to pull natural rights from the theistic realm, because once you pull it out of the theistic realm, it loses its mojo, for lack of better words. It stops making sense.
Yeah, that's how I've always seen natural rights. It's like getting off of natural law for a second, because I like natural law. I love natural rights. I love talking about natural rights. But how I've always considered natural rights is that it's intrinsically tied to religion.
Right.
Whether you believe that is necessarily Christianity, natural rights can work without Christianity. Natural rights can work with you believing that an omniscient creator made us with certain rights. But the whole thing that we were talking about this before the podcast. The whole thing that I wanted to say is, again, I think it's necessary to tell people who are secular that you can be moral. You can be moral without a religious presupposition. The issue is one is more firmly rooted. One is more suited for the long haul. That is natural rights. And you said it best. If rights come from the government, if rights are a human invention, if rights only come from our interpretation of the world and our rationality, rights aren't rights, they're privileges. And privileges this is kind of oxymoronic, but privileges, you have the right to take a privilege away. If you are granting someone a privilege, you can take it away. If man is the grantor of rights, man can take those rights away. If let's say, I don't know how this would work, but let's say a majority of a society, 51%, say that you have a right to free speech. Right. You have a right to free speech. And then all of a sudden, over a decade, that shifts to now the rationale is, listen, we can't risk offending people. It could hurt their mental health. 51% of the population now says that you don't have a right to free speech. So the free speech should be limited or banned. I mean, they have every ability to do so. You can't really fight against that, because you have acknowledged by being in that society that they have the ability to take your privileges away. The only way to have safe rights that are rooted in a creator. And I don't see any other way that you can say in the long haul, rights can be successful.
Right. And
it's funny because as you're saying this, I can just imagine like leftists, if they were actually watch this show, just kind of like squirming in their chair, like, he's talking about religion stuff. Well, and I mean, there would be this. I have a feeling if you have this conversation with someone on the left, there would be an obvious discomfort with the idea that our rights are tied to a divine being or a higher being. But I'm more uncomfortable with the idea that, like as you said, that they're tied. The idea that they're tied to other people.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, because if I believe in God and I believe in an omniscient creator, and I'm pretty sure that creator hasn't changed, does change, or will change, then if he's giving me a right, then that's right. That right is permanent. I don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
It's there. It's always there. It's like a nice little security blanket. Like, I'll always have my rights. If man is the arbiter of my rights, I've got a problem.
I got to be really worried.
I've got to work extra hard to make sure that man is always happy with me, that he doesn't feel he's not petty, that he's not pissed off at me for whatever reason. Because the moment he is, I'm going to lose my rights, and that's a miserable existence when you think about that. Like, can you imagine having to live your life always beholden to someone else?
Right.
Yeah.
And also,
like that just irritates me. Just the thought of it just makes me want to like
and
cut
Eric,
someone.
And Eric, just to shorten your point, you said earlier that that with an atheist, you said that their morality is not well rooted. I would shorten that basically to say you said that you don't have to be, you don't have to be religious nor to be moral. I said no, you don't have to. You can be moral. What
Exactly.
you can't do as an atheist is explain to anyone else why your morality makes sense. We can't. Okay, theists can, but atheists can't. You can be moral. That's about as much as we can expect.
It's kind of like we were talking about before the podcast. It's like, okay, you can argue why honesty is the best policy, why lying is bad, why being honest is preferable to being honest, or you can just tell people they're going to hell if they lie. Like that's the latter. They both have the same effect in theory, right? You can persuade someone to not be a liar by convincing them that lying is bad and that telling the truth is good, or you can tell them they're going to hell. You can convince them that there is this fiery pit that they will suffer for all eternity, and if they lie, they're going there. So don't lie.
The thing is that on the other hand, you have to consider more borderline stuff, or things like I said that where origins come to play. Again, abortion, good example of this, because only one of the two can be true here. If human life is valuable, if we are the result of a creator, that means that creator gave us a purpose. That means you can't just end the life. Doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter what your reason is. If that life did not harm you, did not try to do you any harm, then you don't have the right to end that life. Whereas if the atheist is correct, then ending the life isn't really a big deal. Because at the end of the day, again, that's why it's funny when you hear people that are pro-abortion say they had such a hard time making the decision. Why? Why was it so hard? It shouldn't be hard. If it's just a clump of cells, then end it. Who cares? But the thing is, it's that, but they struggle with it because I believe innately people understand that I can't have it both ways. I can't say that it's just a clump of cells and it doesn't matter, but I do. Either both do or neither does, I would argue. And you can't, and people struggle because I think they innately understand that that's why abortion, even when they're pro-abortion, it's a hard decision. It's very difficult. They struggle with it. They shouldn't, but they do because they understand, I think, innately that there is something wrong with doing this.
Well, yeah, and the other thing is they often say these are just from the arguments I've had. I'm not trying to say that all atheists or secularists argue like this, but from my experience with arguing atheists and secularists, they all say that you can like what you just said. You can essentially argue a position based on your rationality. You can argue that something is moral based on your rationality, because then they ask me, they're like, when, for example, with the liar thing, they say your rationality tells you that lying is bad, correct? And I'm like, yeah, that's what my rational mind tells me. But my rationality is based on a Judeo-Christian framework. Right. Your rationality purely comes from a societal lens. If the society, the reason you can say that rationality favors you right now is because the overall rationality of the society for what is and isn't moral comes from Judeo-Christian framework. The instant the Judeo-Christian framework fades away and society is merely based on the will of man, on the reason of man, then all of a sudden, what would normally not be reasonable now could be reasonable in that society, and vice versa. It's just the reason you're able to argue from where you're arguing right now is because you are in a society of that is based on Judeo-Christian framework. And I don't think it's fair to say that you and your pure rationality put in nature, let's say you find yourself in a state of nature, you're not in our society anymore. I think it's unfair to say that without some sort of base religious framework, you would come out with the same morals that, for example, the United States broadly has developed. Right. I just don't think that's a fair assumption. Not just because, your rationality isn't based on religion, like any sort of religion whatsoever, but also just because what are the odds that you come out valuing the exact same things that are in the Constitution, valuing the exact same things that the Founding Fathers valued? It's just, it's not going to happen.
But except we know that from simple history. We know that, again, something Thomas Sowell said, I believe he said it in several books, but where he said that other, this idea that freedom is something that we value highly. It's just, that George W. Bush made that mistake of thinking that every person yearns to be free. Not exactly. Not every society sees freedom as the top of the important. One example I was introduced to as a child, because I knew people from everywhere, all over the world. So there was this, when my mom was a teacher, and she had a teacher's aide from India. And she had a marriage that was arranged pretty much from birth. Now, fortunately, they did it in such a way that she was happy about it. But I've known a lot of Indian people that'll tell you their parents would just come to them and tell them, okay, you need to marry, you need to let us decide who you marry. And again, when they say, well, what about my choice? They're like, who cares about your choice? You're not even in any position to make it. So basically the idea is, if you feel that you didn't get to make the choice, they don't care, because to them, that doesn't mean anything. Your freedom, who cares about your freedom? The important thing is that you marry someone who's right for the family, stuff like that. There are higher priorities than freedom. This was true in almost every society outside of Western civilization. So the thing is that actually we do know exactly what happens without that framework.
And I like that you brought that up, because one of the things I've been pondering lately is, should we, as a movement, should we move away from the use of the word freedom and focus on using the word liberty? And I know those are synonymous. I know we use those words synonymously. But in my mind, when you use the word freedom, you are creating this mindset of, I can do whatever I want. Right? It's freedom of choice. It's freedom of this. It's freedom of that. I'm free, and if I can't do what I want, then I'm not free. And there's also the progressive usage of the word when they talk about free from hunger, free from want, free from fear. Whereas when we talk about liberty has the kind of connotation of not only rights but responsibilities. Right? That ties nicely to what we're talking about here with natural law and natural rights. If you, and this is something I talk about in that article on Halsey News, is if you have rights by themselves, right, then you're really not much better than an animal if all you do is indulge your rights willy-nilly. If all you do is focus on your responsibility and you don't pay attention to the rights of the individual, then that's totalitarianism. That's tyranny, right? You have to intersect the two. You have to marry the two, rights to responsibilities. What I'd like to start seeing too, and I want to get your take on this, Eric, is because I feel like I'm the only one that does this. When I'm arguing with someone on social issues and somebody says to me, well, I have a right to blah, blah, blah. I will say, no, you don't. And then and when they insist that they do, because I like to piss people off when I'm arguing with them. When they say, no, I do have a right to an abortion. No, you don't. You don't have a right to an abortion. Your right to choose does not include the right to choose somebody else's death. Where does that, when they insist that they do, they say, okay, where does that right come from? What gives you that right? And if they say, well, the Supreme Court, they're like, okay, then I'm just going to push for the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade. Are you going to be happy with that?
No.
Like, I'd like to see people, I would love to see more and more conservatives take that approach and say, look, you don't have a right to do this.
Right.
You never have, and you never will. I don't care what the fucking Supreme Court says, okay?
Right.
You don't have a right to do it. And if you think you do, prove it. Argue where that right comes from.
Yeah.
Or if you're sure that the right is enduring, then just overturn Roe v. Wade. I mean, what does it matter? I mean, after all, you have the right, do you not?
Right.
Well, here's the thing. I don't think it's fair to say that, because I've argued them. I've argued some very smart pro-choice people. And I remember the first time, this was maybe a year and a half ago. So it was a while ago. But the first time I came across this argument, it kind of stumped me. And I think it's because I usually, and now I don't. When I debate, I genuinely try to convince the person over to my side, and I genuinely listen. I want to learn. But before, when I debated, I wanted to just be right. And I wanted to get them to...
I'll be nice at first. I'm not a total dick right off the bat.
Yeah. But I wanted to lure them into a gotcha moment. But what they said when I asked why they have a right, because I actually kind of took a similar approach to you, and I think it works with a lot of people, but there's some smarter people out there it just doesn't work with. For a lot of people who are pro-choice or pro-abortion, when you ask them where that right comes from, they say I'm an autonomous being. That what is inside me. Now, again, this is not supported by the science, but you have to show that the fetus is a life, and that is supported by the science. But they say the fetus in me is not equivalent to that of a full-grown human life, considering it is, in that case, thriving off of me like a parasite, or in some cases part of my body. I have the right as an autonomous being to abort it until it is a separate autonomous being. That's what they said.
So you know what my response to that is because I've gotten that argument too. I said, do you know what implied consent is?
Yeah.
Because for example, when you get a driver's license, right, you unknowingly, most people don't know this, you unknowingly consent to being pulled over by a cop. And it's not a violation of your rights because you gave consent. You waived those rights when you got your driver's license. But guess what? When you had sex, you waived those rights. That is implied consent. You don't get to turn around and say, I'm having second thoughts. I don't want to do this. I have a right to kill this thing inside me because I don't like it. And I'll also use the emotional argument. It's not based in reason at all, but it's damn effective. Is to say, so you think the human life inside you is inferior to your life, and therefore you have a right to kill it. Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Nazi.
Well, and again, I don't know if you've watched much Steven Crowder, Eric, but I was going to say, because Crowder really hit this one really well, where he was saying that, first of all, again, there's that question of where exactly does life start? The only line that is not completely arbitrary is when there is unique genetic code, which is at conception. Once you conceive, there's unique genetic code there that is neither the father's nor the mother's. At that point, it is a unique life right there. Any other line you try to use to draw the beginning of life is totally arbitrary because it can be moved. He said, well, what about viability? Well, viability varies depending on where you are, when you are. Is it more of a life when you're, say, in a big hospital in the U.S. versus like out in the middle of, in Nairobi somewhere? Like I said, all the other lines are arbitrary. Well, I think that after 40 days, okay, or when the baby can feel pain, okay, but that can vary from baby to baby. And again, these things also happen after a person is born in terms of viability. If a person is infirm in certain ways, then are they no longer considered a life? This also works outside the womb too. So ultimately, all the determinations outside of the line at conception are totally arbitrary. So,
to play devil's advocate here, because I've debated some people like this. What if the person says, and I'm not even, because I often say that abortion, it's not my strongest subject and it's not my weakest subject. It's like in between. So like when it comes to really knowledgeable people, when I'm debating on abortion, I have a much harder time. But what if that person
make it, Eric? Just bullshit your way through it. That's all you gotta do, man. I hate
faking it until I make. If honestly, there's been times during debates that like we're in front of a group of people. It's embarrassing to say, but I don't like faking knowing what I'm talking about when I don't.
No, it's a good idea.
If someone says
I'm a total bullshit artist. That's why. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. If someone says something that I just don't know, I don't know the answer to, I don't know any data to counteract it, I'll go like, I don't know. I'll have to look into that. But I think a lot of people are too good at being bullshit artists for their own good. But one of the arguments that I've often heard used by pro-choice advocates, and keep in mind, this is them saying that you can pretty much be aborted until you are exited through the birth canal. The argument is that, okay, we can say that the fetus inside the human is separate genetic code. We can say that it's a new life in a sense, but it's no more new life than an acorn is on an oak tree. If acorns come from oak trees, I'm not sure. They say what makes the difficulty here is they don't look at the scientific for what human life is. They look at the philosophical. So what they say human life is an autonomous being. So you are not technically to them autonomous until you come out the womb, until you can display you are autonomous. Until then, there is no proof you are. So with that logic, you can pretty much abort a baby up until it's about to be birthed. So what would you say to that sort of argument?
I would argue
abort a baby until it's about 2 years old.
I was going to say, yeah, by that logic, you're advocating infanticide because a child is not autonomous until they're paying their own bills, living on their own, feeding themselves.
So basically, up
cleaning up, wiping their own ass. Yeah. So in today's, as I say, in today's society, pretty much you can abort anyone up to the age of 30. Yeah. So I mean,
we can keep people on their parents' medical insurance until then. So hell, you might as well be able to abort them until then.
and I think this is a good wrap up for this, because I think what this illustrates is you get to a point where if you don't have that foundation of rights and responsibilities and natural rights and natural law, then you eventually get to a point where somebody is in a corner, right? And they either, if you present them in that scenario, the whole like, well, then do you believe in aborting someone up to the age of 18? Because until then they're not autonomous. You're gonna get you're gonna get one of two responses. You're gonna get people who kick rocks and walk away because you just stumped them and are pissed off about it, or you're gonna get the guy that says, "Yeah, sure, why not?" Right. And then what do you say to that person? You're like,
"You're insane. I'm gonna go this way now."
I've gotten to that.
Like there's nothing you can't at that point. There's nothing you can say. You just have to agree. Like, okay, you're a murdering fuckwit, and if you come within 100 feet of me, I'm going to shoot you because you might kill me. I'm like, you can't have a peaceful society unless you have that groundwork. So, this is a good conversation. We could go on for hours, literally hours.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, we're out of time. So we'll have to have you back on again. Oh,
see, this is fun. I like this.
It's so disappointing. We're gonna have to have Eric on.
I know it sucks.
No, dude. I can think of at least 3 other topics we could have you for. It's awesome.
No, legit. When you were saying the whole thing about freedom versus liberty, I wanted to go into this whole tirade and it's like unpopular when you first say it bluntly, but like when you explain it, people are like, "Oh yeah, that freedom, like as a principle." Of it, without going into the semantics and without going into the context and the specifics, freedom itself is not always inherently good. I wanted to get into that, right. But we ran out of time.
That will be what we talk about the next time you come back on. So, everyone who's watching, stay tuned. Make sure you're following at real Eric Shaffer.
Shaffer.
At this point, it's like I'm trolling him. He doesn't know.
Really he knows. He knows.
Am I really fucking up his name, or am I just messing with him?
Maybe both.
Maybe little column A, little column B. So follow at real Eric Shaffer. There's no C, and it's spelled like Shaffer. That's how I remember it in my head, and that's why I pronounce it wrong. Make sure you're following John at Kamui Hideyoku. Do not ask me to spell it.
You really need to keep your handle, man.
I keep telling him that, but he's not listening to me.
Okay, fine. I'll change it. Okay.
You should change it to at Childish Gambino.
Oh God,
yes.
No. I refuse to do that. I will be that guy doing the strike a pose shot at the back of the head at that point.
Oh my gosh, I liked it. I enjoyed that music video.
Yeah, it was weird.
I mean, I get the point that it was trying to make, and I also think it's funny when the left was saying, "Don't meme this, guys." Everyone's like, "Okay, so we're definitely going to meme this."
Tell them that don't meme something. They'll totally
it's like the left has never heard of reverse psychology. They just maybe they have, and they really wanted memes because the left can't meme. So, but for more shit posting and insightful nuggets of wisdom and truth, you can follow us at ornery_opinions on Twitter. Make sure you subscribe, and if you like the video once it posts, feel free to share it with a friend or two. Invite them to the live chat next time, then you guys can heckle us and comment and say things.
Get Jordan Peterson to retweet it.
Yeah.
That would make me very happy.
That would make
me very happy too.
I'll be honest. I would love to sit down with Jordan Peterson and just like pick his brain because I've listened to him. I didn't listen to it at first because of all the bad press, and then I got into an argument with the feminists and I started listening to him. I'm like, okay, this guy talks just like I do.
Yeah.
He talks and he thinks
bad press.
just like I do. It is uncanny. Like I want to. It's like looking in a futuristic mirror. I would love to sit down with him and pick his brain. The guy's
Is it
brilliant.
just me, or does he kind of sound like Kermit the Frog?
He does.
Hi ho, Kermit the Frog here.
That's really good.
More things we have in common with him. All right, so make sure, like I said, make sure you're following us at ornery_opinions. Make sure you're following at Real Eric Shaffer, and tune in for when we have him again next time, because we will have him back, because these conversations are fun as hell. Until then, we'll see you guys next week. Next week, we're gonna have our first liberal guest. I'm excited.
Yeah.
We're gonna have I can't remember her name. She wrote an article for. I'll look it up.
I know what you're talking about. I wrote this down.
But she wrote an article for the Washington, not the Washington, the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, you got me excited for a sec.
Yeah, she wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal about how the left kind of needs to do some more introspection and stop like blasting. I think she was a Hillary Clinton campaign staffer too. So it's going to be a very fun conversation. We're gonna talk a little bit about the conversations that should be happening within the parties and between the parties. So I'm really excited to have her on the show. Hopefully she didn't forget, because we scheduled this a couple weeks ago. So I'll confirm with her this week. And if we have her on next week, it's going to be really exciting. I hope you guys will be here in the live chat next week, so you can pose any kind of questions, make some comments, hopefully give her some things to respond to, because she's very nice. She has the article in the Wall Street Journal was very, very good, both in terms of its prose as well as its ideas. So I will tweet it out tonight when I confirm with her, and I'll highly recommend you read the article. Eric, thanks again for coming on the show. It's always a pleasure having you, man.
Thanks for having me, man.
All right, and we'll forgive you your heresy by comparing Aquinas to what's his face? Kant.
Kant and Locke.
Kant. And thanks again. You guys have a great week. Adios, man.
See you later.